and of course, right? So
Yeah,
what
sure.
I'm gonna,
Yeah, that'd be great.
okay, and what I'm gonna do is to ask you to talk about, to say who you are, what you do. Then I'm gonna have a bunch of questions. Okay, so we
Great.
can. You ready to get started? But it's so
All
good to
good.
see you, by the way. It's a.
I know it's been a long time.
I know. Yeah. So tell us your name and what you do, and yeah, that's enough. Then I'll start with the
Sure.
questions.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Nikhil Goyal. I am currently a sociologist. I'm finishing up my PhD at the University of Cambridge. I've been writing and exploring issues in education for many years now, and I currently live in New York.
Well, thanks, Nico. I remember the first time you caught me. You were in high school. So
Right.
basically, tell me about how you kind of ran around away from school, and that's the whole process, and how you've made a living so far.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I think I remember reaching out to you because I'd read a lot of your work, and I was particularly interested in looking at first the critique of the school system, of the conventional school system, but also how we could change it and transform it to be more humane, more equitable, more child-centered. When I was in high school, I was particularly bored in school. I didn't find it to be quite engaging. A lot of the subjects I was learning didn't have a particular sense of relevance for me. And so I started to reach out to experts like yourself and other people to understand the issues in the American public education system and also other systems around the world. And since then, I've gone into more academic forms, and I'm an ethnographer, so I've been particularly interested in examining young people's experiences across various systems: education, criminal justice, housing, and other facets of society, particularly in urban settings. And so I've been particularly interested in examining how young people engage and negotiate their own educational experiences, and what does a transformed system look like that is more attuned to the needs of learners themselves.
So eventually, after high school, did you go to college?
I went to a small school in Vermont called Goddard College. It's a liberal arts school. I believe it was founded by a disciple of John Dewey about 100 years ago. And so I spent some time there, and then went on to do my graduate studies at Cambridge. And so that's where I've been for the past couple of years, on and off.
So what? Because when after high school, I felt like you were writing, you were working in New York. I felt like I never felt like you went to college, because I've been, I follow
Right.
you ever since. So how many years were you at Goddard College?
I was at Goddard about 2 years. So they have for those of you not familiar, Goddard is a low residency school. So it's you spend a short amount of time on campus, and the rest of the time is out in the world. I mean, for me, it worked because I was able to travel and go to different places and be in New York and visit lots of schools. I spent a lot of time at Goddard visiting lots of progressive schools in the U.S. And I also had a chance to go to England and visit the Summerhill School. So it was actually quite enjoyable experience. I think the model of education worked for me. I don't know if it works for everyone because of it can be very unstructured, in that if you don't have an idea what you like to do, it may not work. But for me, it worked quite well because I felt it was, I could talk with my the faculty members who I was working with on a regular basis, and check in with them on what I was doing, and then go back to my regular work. And so I thought it was a pretty flexible system.
Well, I mean, you are pretty amazing. You practice what you write, what you talk about. So tell us, since you visited the school at Summerhill, tell us a little bit about Summerhill, your visit. What was
Yeah.
it like?
Well, it was very revelatory because I read Summerhill a number of years ago, and as most people who read Summerhill, they're usually struck by not just Neil's ideas, A.S. Neil's ideas on education, but on childhood, on development. And so it was always an interest in mine to visit the school because, it's incredible. They'll be celebrating their 100th anniversary next year. And I consider the school to be a bedrock of democratic education. And so I'd visited a couple of free and democratic schools in the US before visiting Summerhill. So I was familiar with the philosophy. But it was quite interesting because there was two things I was exploring. One was about 2 decades ago, there was a major court battle with the British government where the British government actually tried to shut down the school, partly because they don't require classes. They have non-compulsory lessons. So the kids don't have to go to lessons. And the vast majority, they end up actually going to lessons probably by age 7 or 8 or 9. So that was an issue of contention. And then later on, I was also interested in what does that model look like all these years later? Like, could you still preserve the philosophy of Neil in the high stakes culture of education? And the UK is a little bit different than the US insofar that the private schools there are more regulated by the government than in the US. In the US, basically they can do whatever they want. But in the UK, it's a little, the curriculum is still, affected by what the Department of Education asks and dictates. So it's a little bit different in that they're under different guidelines. But it was incredible to sit in on the democratic meetings, to talk with the kids, to talk with Neil's daughter Zoe and her sons who are now running the school. I spent a couple of weeks there, over the course of 2 years. So I had a chance to go back there and sit in on classes. And the most interesting thing was the democratic meeting. I think that to me is the thing that I think fascinates adults the most, the idea that kids can actually hash out conflicts and incidents that happen at school in a democratic, respectful manner. So I thought that was really quite fascinating. I'd seen that approach at the Philly Free School, but seeing that in person at Summerhill, where a lot of it originated, was really interesting.
Well, that's fascinating. So tell me about you. You were saying that your approach may not apply to others. Why do you say that? Why, I would think that every student is unique and different ways. How did you become who you are now? You think about reflect on your life a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, what I was referring to is the Goddard approach. The Goddard approach is a little bit unique in that there's really, you kind of create the entire curriculum. And I think if you're coming into that without a little bit more of a support system, it can be quite difficult to succeed. But I definitely, I would certainly agree with the idea that yes, children are natural learners. They need a personalized, individualized approach to education. And for me, growing up, I think I got a lot of that for the simple fact that my parents gave me a lot of freedom to learn. I went to the library very often. I was taken to the library very often, got to, developed a very early passion for reading. And I, learned how to learn. I think that is the ultimate skill that, that kids in school are just unfortunately not really taught. How do you learn on your own? How do you self-direct your own learning? And how do you create and craft an educational experience if you want to learn something? And so I think that was very helpful for me, especially after high school, because if there was something I wanted to learn, I knew who to go to, what class, where on YouTube I had to go, or what books I had to read, or which experts or people I had to reach out to. So I think that was very helpful for me. And I think
in essence, you learned how to learn from your parents and by yourself, right? Would you say that?
I think a lot of it was by myself. I mean, certainly my parents, they gave me the resources to do that. And they, I had internet, I had a safe home, I had food, I had all these kind of things that could allow me to do these kinds of things. So it made it easier, I think. But I think I would also say that one of the, I was very critical of my high school experience, but one of the few things I always say that was two things that I actually particularly enjoyed about it was one, being on the cross country team. partly because it was actually I thought it was a very good way to understand how to set personal goals and for yourself, especially when you're trying to achieve a certain number of miles over a summer. And the teamwork and collaboration and all those sorts of things, I think, were really helpful. But also the second thing was speech and debate. I think that, to me, if we had to make something mandatory in schools, I think speech and debate would be something to certainly have kids engage in, because it taught me how to build an argument, how to advocate for myself, how to speak publicly, how to grapple with things in a very extemporaneous way. I was an extemporaneous speaker, and I think that those types of skills that I built in speech and debate were extremely helpful, and I use them virtually every day today. So I think
you are, apparently, I remember many years ago you were articulate in the way, or as a young child. Now you are even more articulate. You've been doing research on the U.S. education from a honestly very fresh perspective, because most educational researchers would take a slice of it, analyze it. You really approached it from a very philosophical. I was very appreciative of your latest book. Tell us, tell us, or tell me, and tell what did you find? What's wrong with education today?
So I think there's a series of issues in terms of public education. I think I usually split it into two ways. One is, I think you have over the past 3 decades, the more market-based approach to education, privatization, austerity, expanding charter schools or very regimented charter schools, pay for performance, and high stakes testing. And so I think on one hand, you're seeing as many activists and scholars have been writing about, the erosion of public education, the idea that public education is no longer treated as a public good, a universal public good for all. And so I think on one hand, you're seeing, there are real systemic problems with the system on that end. On the other hand, I also extend it to the fact that the fundamental model of education is not only antiquated, but it's based on a very nefarious view of human development intelligence. It's based on the idea that children are not innately curious or creative or should be trusted. I think if you look at the structures of schooling, all the way from the fact that the homework to the bell structure, the 45-minute periods, the sitting in desks and rows, the age segregation, the regimented curriculum, and also just the kind of crazy rules you see in school, like asking permission to use the bathroom. Like, they're not built to develop agency and self-determination. They're built to produce compliance. And so I think I usually frame it in those two senses: the defense of public education, but also a call to reimagine it, specifically for the learners and the teachers, because I think they're both greatly underserved by that model.
So I mean, because I'm working on this book to reimagine. I call learners without borders, because I think we have so many walls that's closing students off. One of them is this age idea. So you have to be a certain age, graduate from high school before you can go do anything else. But we know that today, I'm sure this is what I want to learn from you. The youngsters, the young generation, you can actually work from home when you are like age 5. You can be making money. You can join this. So have you seen any young people doing those kind of things? Just making money, making a business, or doing their own thing. Schools actually is on the side.
Yeah. No, I think you're. I mean, there have been examples, like, for example, Kane's Arcade. A young, I believe he was a teenager or even younger than a teenager. He was in Los Angeles, and he created a makeshift arcade at home. And there was a documentary film made about him. Somebody who was just using free time, play, exploration to invent products and ideas. I also think you see that also with high school kids who they may be unschoolers, or they may be homeschoolers, or individuals who kind of have a mesh between the two. They, trying to learn a different skill. I've interviewed lots of different young people over the years who, if they're interested in something like STEM or STEAM education, building things like maker spaces and other types of products as part of the maker movement, like 3D printers or and so forth. So I think there's lots of young people who are trying to tap into that. I think, to me, the solution is to marry that with marry those ideas into the school environment, because kids have lots of energy and passion and interest in things that may not be expressed in the school. There was one of the schools I visited is called the Workshop School and in Philadelphia, and it's quite a fascinating school because they've been featured. They've been participating in various programs, automotive programs, where they build cars to race them. And this is an example where this is a particularly poor Black and brown community in Philadelphia, and these kids are given the tools and the resources to let their imaginations go wild. And I think that is, and actually engages them and keeps them in school and keeps them engaged in their education, as opposed to a very humdrum, boring curriculum. And I think the school without walls, I'm sure you're familiar with the school without walls concept, because I think that, to me, is the ultimate vision of what I like to see in terms of public education. How do you break down these walls? How do you break down these silos and treat the community and the city as a classroom? John, I often cite this quote by John Holt, who talks about, the most proper place for children to be in is in the mainstream of adult life, is among professionals, is among mentors, and in public spaces. Because I think that's where real education happens, in museums, in laboratories, in gymnasiums, and city hall, and what have you. I think those are the civic centers. I think those are the places where children should be. And we've, in the 60s and 70s, we had lots of examples of that, where we did that on a grand scale. And I think we should try to revive some of that today.
That's a great idea. So I'm going back to your life again. Remember, when you were in high school, you were interviewing people, you were writing book, you were going around giving speeches. Or how did you manage your life, if you still remember that time?
Well, I graduated high school in 2013, and I graduated actually a couple months early. And my senior year, technically, I managed to have like 4 classes where it was just to finish the requirements. So I spent the rest of the time, being like, I would get out of school at 11 a.m. and be able to get to New York City by like 1 p.m. So I could go to conferences. And a lot of it was, reaching out to people like yourself and others and just asking them for a few minutes of their time. Had a list of questions. I read a book you wrote or an article you wrote, and I was just wondering if I could ask you, some more detail on that. And then going to the conferences and hearing people speak, I found it to be very revelatory and world changing for me, that I could go to these conferences and I asked them, I'm a student, could I get a discounted pass or a free pass? I would just love to sit in on a few of these talks. And the reality is, when you're a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid, most adults, most adults will want to help you in that, and they're very kind in that. So I actually found going to conferences and just kind of doing that in an ad hoc way was very worthwhile for me.
And your school did not pressure you? Your school did not say, God, Nikhil, you got to stay here. Did they pressure you?
The funny thing is that I was always like at the point of hitting the most number of absences, because I there was a very strict number of times you could miss school. And so I was always like on the brink of it, which was a problem. But, in reality, as I reflect on that, like if I were a school administrator or a principal, wouldn't you want to encourage someone like myself to do those kinds of things? Like I felt like that it wasn't right for my school to, they should have been asking me where I was going. Like,
did they ask you? Did they ask?
They never. There was no kind of communication in that sense. And And I would always say, like, it's not that I'm just skipping school for, for no reason. It's because I'm trying to learn something. I'm trying to go to conferences. I'm trying to go to events. And so I felt
So you never communicated with the school about what you were doing?
No, I mean, I told them where I was going, but there was no, on numerous occasions, but they were never able to give me like an excuse absence from that. I mean, I remember distinct conversations where I actually had to miss many things I'd like to go to because of, the nature of the school attendance law. And so, yeah, that was actually an ongoing issue. My teachers were, some of my teachers were very, happy and with what I was doing. But when I brought it to the school administrators and I asked them to get time off or excuse absence, they were very reluctant to do so.
Huh. Now, I got to ask you this question. What are you studying at Cambridge?
So I'm studying sociology of education. So I'm at the Faculty of Education. I am hopefully graduating within a couple months with my PhD. So you'll start calling me doctor soon. But yeah, no, I've been conducting an ethnographic study in Philadelphia, examining young people who've been pushed out of high school. And so looking at the alternative school system, particularly for young people who have dropped out, and how do they navigate various systems in their lives. The neighborhood I am focusing on is the largest open air drug market on the East Coast. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. And so I've been following a group of young people over the past couple of years, their trajectories both in school and then after the ones who graduate, and seeing what they end up doing. It's been a really fascinating journey. I started going there about 5 years ago, and so I've been on and off in Philly since then.
Can you share a few points of your dissertation, your discoveries? What are the main points?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. One is in Philadelphia, there have been, if we're talking about the public education issue, there was 23 school closures in 2013. It was one of the largest school closures in U.S. history. It's also been a city. It's the poorest. It's the poorest large city in America. And so, I've been noticing, the effect that poverty has on education. Why do kids drop out? I usually split it in a few different ways, and a lot, the literature review also does that as well, which is looking at the school, the family, and the school and the family, and then the community at large, and socioeconomic issues. And so I would say, at least from what I've seen, is a lot of kids are being pushed out. They are disengaged in schools. The classes are very large. They're not, there's a lack of belonging, bullying, truancy, very restrictive zero tolerance discipline where suspensions, expulsions push kids out of school. But then also on the family side, kids have to work. Their parents are unemployed. A parent is incarcerated. They need to take care of siblings. And then also the community front, systemic violence and destabilizing communities in terms of school closures. So I would say there's a multitude of reasons, usually not just one. There's a whole sort of both personal as well as structural reasons why kids leave school. And then on top of that, I've been looking at the school to prison pipeline. So how are young people criminalized from these disciplinary structures, both in school, but also out of school by police, by the courts, by the criminal justice system at large. Many of the young people I've talked to have been involved in the juvenile justice system. They've had to go through the trauma and the stigma of juvenile delinquency. And so what does that mean for their lives after, in school and then after they graduate? Because, one of the research is very overwhelming when they show that youth who've been in the juvenile justice system have very low graduation rates. And even if they do graduate, are they going to, the vast majority are not going on to college. They are probably going on to, low wage, minimum wage jobs that are precarious, that are not going to provide them the sufficiency to, to live dignified lives. And so, there's a huge structural problem I find when we're talking about these issues. And there's also large gaps I think in learning. The alternative schools I've spent time at, and the GED centers as well, the kids are coming in, on a 4th or 5th grade reading level or mathematics level. There's just, the question I always ask is, how is it that they spend 12 years in school and they're on a 4th or 5th grade reading level? Like, what happened during that entire span of time for them to arrive at this point? And the reality is the vast majority of them are disengaged and I would say traumatized learners. They're disengaged and traumatized learners. They've never been given the tools and resources to become self-determined and self-directed. And that, unfortunately, I think is the great shame of the system.
Well, so right now, we have this fortunate in this racial reckoning. We're trying to go reflect on the systemic approaches to racism. I mean, I think schools have plays actually a bigger role. We have not been called to examine school systems. I think schools actually do a lot of harm to kids, because when I'm writing this book, I'm talking about one group of kids who are like this teenage entrepreneurs. They can get out, they can do whatever they want. They should drop out. They can go seek different options. Otherwise, they're forced out. You already have two types, the other types. So toward the end, do you have any recommendations? Where can we go?
Yeah, I mean, and to your point on the, the reckoning, the national reckoning we're having with systemic racism and policing in this country, I think, people are talking about that in the context of schools, and how do schools participate and actually perpetuate some of those racist structures and policies. I mean, we earlier we were talking about the high-stakes testing and the privatization. A lot of those reforms have been disproportionately targeting African-American and Latino kids in the urban settings. And they've been the ones who've been, stuck in schools that are literally crumbling, schools that don't have running water or have mold growing. So I think you have a funding issue, you have a funding inequity where you're seeing, where I think we need to, a multi-billion-dollar investment into the poorest schools in the country. But then also we've got to, there's a model of education called community schools, and community schools, I think, are really quite fascinating in that they recognize that schools are not isolated institutions, that they are affected by, a kid walks in to a school building and they don't leave behind the poverty, the homelessness, the domestic violence, the food insecurity, all those issues that they're grappling with. They bring it into the school building. And so I think a whole child approach to education, restorative justice, a culturally relevant curriculum, wraparound services, all in one space where children can feel safe and nurtured, I think is the most effective means. I was writing a couple of years ago about a school actually started by LeBron James, which is a community school, which has many of these wraparound services available. And I think that's the future of public education. I think, if we can bring the democratic progressive principles of schools, of education into the traditional system, where the vast majority of kids are, 90% of kids go to public schools. So that's where the kids are. That's where I think we need to direct our energies to.
Perfect, man. You are great as usual. Wonderful. Just getting even better. Thank you so much.
Great.
All right. Take care.
All right. I'll see you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Am I late to the meeting? I thought it started at 1.
No, I think the meeting has been changed to next week.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
No worries.
But welcome. I was just saying goodbye to a friend, but yeah.
Okay.